Good morning. This is part 3 of our lecture on Chapter 8 involving contracts. And you may recall where we have been up until now is essentially saying that the time element of these kinds of relationships requires enforceability that wasn't there when we dealt with property law. And this actually reduces uncertainty, even though it holds the promisor's feet to the fire with regards to fulfilling contracts. So we're going to start by talking about what promises should be enforced and what the consequences of that enforcement is going to be. When we get to Chapter 9, it's going to be a pretty quick tour. We're going to really focus on the different remedies. So we'll talk a bit about a lot of different ways of dealing with a breach of contract. Expectation damages, sort of the benefit of the bargain or the expected profits, is the standard way that we're going to talk about now, but we will look at some other applications later on. Okay, so we can use some game theory to analyze this situation with regards to the contractual relationships and what happens when they're not enforceable and what happens when they are enforceable. So the way we set it up is we've got two parties involved. Party one is the promisee. So that is the person who's making some sort of investment into the relationship that the promisor, party two, is supposed to perform. And by performing, that will create a return both for party one, the promisee, the one to whom the promise was made, and the other party receiving a return, basically a profit, based upon their following through with the contract. Okay, so party one's going to put up some asset, something of value. The way we're going to illustrate it is if they are investing a number equal to 1. It could be $1, it could be $1,000, $1,000,000. It doesn't matter. We're really looking at the scales here, not so much the actual amount. So they're going to put some money in and receive their money back and then a return on that. If the other side does not follow through, they're going to put the money in and not get something back. Okay. So party two, the one who made the promise, the promisor, will either cooperate or appropriate. Cooperate means, yes, they will follow through with what they promised. And appropriate, of course, means that they will not follow through with what they promised. And we start this analysis to show why it is important that, in fact, contracts be enforceable. Because if they're not enforceable, you're running into a lot of trouble. And if you appropriate, the law recognizes that appropriation could be severe and must have consequences associated with it. Let me give you an example of what happens when somebody doesn't follow through. And in essence, it does become an enforceable contract. Right? And you'll see as I explain it. I think it'll make more sense. And this is the California Labor Code, Section 970. And it has to do with misrepresentation in basically an employment relationship. Okay, so I'm going to read it to you. Not that I'm going to ask you on an exam to recite it back, but rather to kind of understand what the rules are in California, why they are there, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the consequences of that. And I have experience in dealing with this situation. So, 970 California Labor Code states, no person, I'm going to paraphrase some of it. No person, agent, etc., shall influence, persuade, or engage any person to change from one place to another in the state or from any place outside of the state or from any place within the state to a place outside of the state for the purpose of working in any branch of labor through or by means of knowingly false representations, whether spoken, written, or advertised in printed form concerning the type of the work, the length of the assignment, the sanitary or housing conditions relating to the work, and the existence of any labor dispute that may impact sort of the working environment. Okay, so what they're saying is this is what is known as wrongful recruitment. And it's wrongful recruitment in the sense that somebody promised somebody to go and take a job. Maybe they moved from Northern California to Southern, Oregon to California, California to Wisconsin, and basically not fully revealing the nature of the employment relationship. And there's going to be consequences associated with that. Section 972 of the Labor Code has the consequences, and that is you can double the damages. You're not required to, but it opens the door for the juries to decide to double the damages. I'm going to give you two examples. One that the plaintiff was victorious, another one that the plaintiff was not victorious, that where this appropriation, this misrepresentation comes into play. And you can see why having enforceability of contracts, which we'll be heading to in a little bit, is so important. In the first of these cases, and both of these I was working on behalf of the plaintiff. First of these cases, a guy was living up in Oregon, single dad. He's recruited to come down to Orange County for a job. And the job was completely misrepresented. I think the compensation was misrepresented. I think the nature of the job duties was misrepresented. I don't know whether there was a length of time of the promise of the job, because look, you're not going to move from one state to another for a job that's going to be gone in a month. So it's been a few years, but there probably was some sort of promise that you would at least work for a year or two or whatever. And these things did not materialize. And he sued. And he won. I think the jury did not get around to doubling the damages because they got a little bit confused about damages, but it's clearly a case where there was misrepresentation, and he would have never pulled up his household, taking his child with him, to move as far as he did without some sort of promise for some sort of continual employment, at least to some length of time. Okay, that's example number one. Example number two was a single woman who was working in Hawaii, and the same entity, which will remain nameless, offered her a position in Orange County again, and the promise was, you'll come here, you're going to get paid well, and we promise you employment for at least 2 years. And she moves, and obviously a move from Hawaii to California is going to be expensive, furniture and all that kind of stuff. And after 6 months, the employer said, well, we thank you for your service. You've done what you needed to do for us, and we're going to let you go. And she sued. And because of the nature of that employment relationship, she was forced to go to arbitration for that. The first one was a jury trial. The second one was not. And she actually lost, to my shock. The arbitrator ruled on behalf of the defendant, and essentially, even though it doesn't have to be in writing, we said spoken written here in Section 970, it never was in writing, and the defendant said, we never made that promise. Logic would tell me, why would somebody move that far unless there was a promise of employment for a certain length of time? But in fact, the arbitrator ruled for the defendant and gave a small little thing having to do with unpaid wages for the plaintiff, but it was pretty minimal at that point. Okay, so how would we illustrate the situation in sort of a game theory sense when we are looking at a circumstance where party two can choose to cooperate or appropriate? So draw this little box here that kind of illustrates things. Party one is the one making the investment. They're the ones to whom the promise was made. Party two is the one that's supposed to fulfill the contract. Party one initiates it by either investing or not investing. Okay, and remember, the investment is always scaled to a value of 1, all right? So if there's no investment, we've got zeros all the way around. As usual, the payoff to the party here on the left is going to be the lower box, and the payoff to the party on top is going to be the upper box. Okay, so let's say party one does invest. they are going to get their investment of 1 back, and then let's say make a return of 0.5. Okay, doesn't have to be that, it could be any number, but there's some sort of positive return, 50% in this case. And party 2, for cooperating and following through on the contract, will go ahead and earn their profit as well, and that's also equal to 0.5. Okay. That's if they cooperate. That's if they perform. Okay. Remember, this is not an enforceable contract, which is why we get away from this really fast and do have, by law, enforceable contracts. Okay. Now, what if you invest and party 2 appropriates? That means they're going to take the money and run. The investment was 1, they grab that back, they're off, okay? And they're ahead by 1. Obviously, party 1 that made the investment is behind by 1. They've lost their investment. And so the question is, what is the optimal thing to do here? The optimal thing to do clearly for party 2 is appropriate, and knowing that they're likely to end up with a negative result versus 0 if they don't invest at all. Party 1's not going to invest. The contract is not going to be followed through. You will not follow through with the contract. Okay, so this is clearly inefficient because it's efficient to go ahead, invest, and cooperate, because here we have a 0 sum. Here we've got a gain of 1 in total. And remember, party 1 is getting their $1 whatever investment back on top of it. Okay, so they really get like 1.5. They make a half. Efficiency has been enhanced if in fact we have cooperation. So what we do there is go ahead and now set up a contract where either you're going to perform or you're going to breach the contract. Okay, but if you breach the contract, you're going to be penalized. You're going to have to make good and provide, let's say, the expectation damages of what the first party thought they would get by investing in the contract, and be made whole, effectively. That's illustrated in the box over here. Again, party 1 on the side, party 2 on top. And now the choices are to perform or to breach. If you perform, we get the same 0.5 return. If you breach, party 1 gets their 0.5 return. Those are their expectation damages. Party 2 is on the hook for the expectation damages. Besides returning the money that they took to begin with, they have to also give them the benefit of the bargain, what they expected to earn under the contract. Okay. Now, you can see here, it's a very different story because the efficient thing is actually to perform and cooperate. And resources are enhanced in a circumstance like that. Okay. Now, what do we mean by expectation damages? Well, you got to be careful. So, for instance, if you're assuming that I was going to make $1 million in revenue, you don't get the $1 million in revenue. What would have been the contribution to the bottom line? What would have been the, when we take into account, let's say, the variable expenses that you don't have to pay because somebody did not, in fact, follow through with the contract, you save that money. It's really what kind of profits when all is said and done. That's irrelevant. So when someone calls me up and says, oh, my client lost $500,000 in revenue a year, that's not the loss. The loss is going to be how much of that is really going to turn into cash flow or profits, like in an accounting sense. And that becomes the relevant measure. Okay, we'll pick this up in part 4.